Right, hello everyone, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about the French defense and mainly how to play against it from the white perspective. We are going to be doing this in the format of a tier list. As usual, there's going to be timestamps, so if you want to skip straight to the S tier, feel free to do so. But without further ado, we're going to start off as usual with the bottom of the bottom, F tier. And so to begin with, we are going to be looking at this move on move 2 with F4, which, I mean, if you know anything about opening theory or even not, you'd probably know the D4, grabbing as much space in the center is probably the best move. However, some people really just like touching their F pawn, but you know, F pawn, F tier sort of speaks for itself. When you neglect the center like this, let's say after, I mean, first of all, you don't really want to exchange because then you sort of open the center, and with the F pawn just creating a lot of weaknesses in general, you don't really want to do this. It makes much more sense to play something like E5, trying to gain space, making use of this F pawn. However, as black plays the typical move C5, which is, you know, what they always do in the French, controlling the center like this, it becomes very difficult for black to really fight for their fair share of, for white to fight for their fair share of the center. And very often they can't even really establish a pawn on D4 without it ending up in some danger. For example, let's say we play the following moves, white plays C3. I think objectively best it might just be in white's best interest to play something like D3, because after D4, as I was saying, let's say C takes D4, knight F5, because white spent this time very early on the opening by playing F4, now in the long run they have a lot of difficulties protecting this D4 pawn, which is why, you know, they have to instead do something more passive like D3. But obviously if you can't really, you know, play as actively in the center as you want to like this, the whole opening concept has to be at least a bit questionable. And just to show one nice idea that black has in these sorts of positions is they'll very often put a knight in F5, and to just stop anything in the future like G4 kicking this knight out, what black will very often do is play this move H5 actually, which might look like a bit of a weakening move on the king side. However, it really just establishes this knight on the F5 square for the long run, making this position very pleasant for black and unpleasant for white. Fortunately for today's video, there's going to be only one other entry in the F tier, which is going to be after D4, the exchange variation, but not the exchange variation itself, but rather when white plays C4 in this position. There are two sorts of ways that you can play the exchange variation, and one of them is going to be like playing knight F3 and bishop D3 and just sort of developing very naturally, but the other one's going to be to play more confrontationally in the center with C4 very early on. And this may be a bit controversial. Some people will look at this and be like, whoa dude, like this isn't that bad. But to be honest, like, I just think this variation is really overrated. Not overrated in the sense that you have a lot of books recommending it, basically no books recommend this rubbish, but the problem is that black can just obtain a very like simple setup against the isolated queen's pawn in the long run after, you know, eventually have some sort of exchange of pawns. By after knight c3, either playing knight e7 and knight f6, we're not forced to take or anything. Let's say like knight e7 happens, we have some developing moves, something like this, knight c6, bishop g4 coming next, putting pressure on this knight in this diagonal. It's just really difficult for white to really keep control over this d4 pawn and, you know, like keep it protected. And in general in these lines, I also just don't really feel that white really has the attacking chances that they really want when they take on the isolated queen's pawn to begin with. It really just sort of feels like they're babysitting a lot of the time. So yeah, feel free to disagree with me, but I am putting this one in the F tier. Moving up into the C tier, however, this is where things get slightly less worse. The first move we're going to be looking at B3. This could arguably even maybe be in B tier. It's not that bad actually. And basically one of the key ideas of this line is that on move 3 after D5, we're not going to touch the E pawn actually. We're just going to play bishop B2 and let black, if they're interested, to take the E4 pawn. And basically what we're arguing is that we're going to play knight C3 next, try and gang up on this guy, win it back, and then we have this bishop on the long diagonal in the long term that's going to put pressure on the black camp. And of course, basically black has two main options in the position. They can either play knight f6, just holding onto the pawn with the piece, or they can be very greedy and insist that, you know, because after knight f6, very often white actually wins back the pawn with queen e2. But when you play f5, you're really like, no, I'm holding onto the pawn with my dear life here, not letting that guy go. But the problem is that you really overextend with this move and create a lot of weaknesses in your camp in the long run. Not to mention, you're just really falling behind development at this point with black. White's probably going to play like something like queen e2, long castles next, or maybe just develop the bishop out this way and castle short even. Really tons of nice compensation for white in this position. Usually though, what's more common is just knight f6 and then after queen e2. Even these positions I think are pretty promising for white. black has to play pretty accurately if they want to equalize. For example, I think like bishop b4 in this position, the best move is queen e7, just trying to go bishop a3 and trade these bishops off. But a lot of people have just tried to play bishop takes c3, once again, you know, wanting to hold on to the e4 pawn, a very natural instinct for many players. But after this very interesting move d takes e3, opening up the file for the rook, not bishop takes e3, black can very often run into trouble after something like g4, trying to like, you know, blow up the king side here. In fact, looking at the Lichess database right now, there's like over 900 games from this position, and white has a 63% score, sorry, 63% win rate, so it's like, you know, when you account for draws, maybe like 65 or something like that. And there's a lot of weird sort of like wacky ideas in these lines that some aggressive players will definitely find a liking too. However, the sort of problem with this line is probably objectively d takes e4 might even be best, but one thing from a practical point of view I don't like a whole lot is just knight f6 in this position, where black simply ignores taking this for now and is like, well, white, if you don't do anything, I'm just going to play knight takes e4, right? And of course, again, you don't really want to play e takes d5, because now you're in exchange French, where your bishop on b2 just sort of looks weird, so you don't really want to go into this. And if you play e5 then, which is the only other reasonable move basically, then after knight of d7, you're probably going to play d4, but now you're in a sort of weird French advance where you've fianchetted your dark squared bishop, which still scores not so badly in the database for white. We're not worse or anything like that, but I also don't think I would argue that white has any advantage. And so for that reason, we are putting this once again in the C tier. Another line which goes in the C tier is going to be the advanced variation, except in this case there are a couple different lines in the advanced variation. The one we're going to be looking at is where white essentially plays bishop e2 on move 6 against either bishop d7 or queen b6. And that's one thing I'd like to note. There are a couple of different ways black can play the exchange variation, either where they play queen b6 immediately or bishop d7. Sometimes they transpose, and arguably bishop d7 might even be objectively stronger, but queen b6 is still very common, definitely the most common move in the database at least. Essentially the idea is just to put pressure on this d4 pawn, but the bishop coming to d7 also developing it like this is a very natural move. And basically against both of these approaches, I don't think bishop e2 is too good. For example, against bishop d7, bishop e2, f6 from what I understand is like a pretty annoying move to face. And also against queen b6, bishop e2, very often in these positions after takes, the most accurate move from blacks is just play knight h6. It's a bit inaccurate, I believe, to play knight e7, because then white will play knight a3, knight c2, and just protect this pawn in time, and this position is actually pretty decent for white. However, the big problem with this line is that after knight h6 instead, now you can't really play knight a3 because we haven't blocked this bishop with the knight on e7 instead on h6, so we can just simply take this and then go knight f5, and this pawn is incredibly difficult to defend. And you might sort of be wondering, like, Sam, what if we just take the knight on h6? What then, right? Well, the problem now is we could take, but what's even stronger is actually playing the in-between move, queen takes b2, very well-known idea in these positions, where we just ignore the bishop hanging on h6 for a moment, and of course counter-attack the rook on a1. White can play a move like knight d2, but after takes we're a pawn up, this pawn's a bit weak. The engine says this is maybe around equal, like, I don't know, wants to play rook b1 or something, harass our queen. Maybe it's not completely terrible for white, but personally I've never really saw the big appeal in trying to play the advanced variation with bishop e2. There are some other options we're going to talk about later, like a3 in this position, also bishop d3 called the Barry Milner Gambit. Also, just one final note, in this position we looked at takes and like you know, like knight a3, which clearly doesn't work, but it's like already this is quite difficult for white to play, because like if they just castle, for example, knight f5, and they actually literally cannot protect this pawn. Like if they go bishop e3, they hang b2 then. So yeah, just a really nice, short, simple example of how things can quickly go wrong, of course, in the French advance if white is not vigilant of stuff like this, just attacking the d4 pawn. And for our final entry into the C tier, we are going to be looking at what is called the two knights variation, where white plays the two knights out to f3 and c3. And against, like, for example, with the Caro-Kann, the two knights is actually pretty good. It's one of the, maybe not the best variations, but definitely one of the most solid ones. You can play for an advantage and not have to know like a shit ton of theory. However, unfortunately, the same thing doesn't really apply to the French, I believe. Like, sure, we'd be happy to see something like d takes e4, especially d4. This is actually quite nice, these positions. One nice trap is after d3, knight f4, c4. It looks like black is sort of boxing white's pieces in here, but after queen a4 check, the house of cards is following, and white is going to be a queen 2 pawns up actually. And even in this position, if you avoid d3 with black and you say play knight c6 and then you like try to play e5 next, hold into the whole center, It looks promising until you see after c takes d4, queen a4. Now there's just simply no way for black to hold on to the d4 pawn. Again, if you play d3 in this position, really overextending this guy, after knight d4 you can't defend this and this at the same time. And if you can't play d3, well, there's no way you can really protect the pawn. You can't play e5 because knight takes d5. If you play bishop d7, we just take. No dangerous discovered attacks here. For example, after knight takes d4, simply takes and it's pawn up advantage. But the big issue of this line is after knight f6, e5, d4, c5, it's incredibly difficult for white to really hold together their sort of fragile pawn center. And despite the conventional wisdom being that you should try and keep the tension, that doesn't really work here. For example, you try to play a move like bishop e2 after takes, you're just going to hang a pawn on e5. And if you recapture with the queen, then knight c6 develops with tempo and again attacks e5, which pretty much means that in this position, white usually takes on c5. There's also some weird variation with bishop g5 that scores quite well in the database. I'm not really sure what it's about. I think one of the ideas is you go after bishop e7. This is pretty bad because you just take and go knight b5 and this is a very typical idea. It happens in the French a lot of the time. But after queen b6, I don't really know what the idea is, to be honest. But the line I'm most familiar with is simply just going d takes c5 here. I actually played this myself a bit when I was a bit younger. However, the problem with these lines is that you can sort of get an okay attacking position a lot of the times. It scores well in the database as well because a lot of people just fall into this trap, after castles, falling for the Greek's gift sacrifice, where you're getting mated in this case, and the other case, your king is just getting chased around very quickly. Say f5, I think queen g3 is the one here, and this king, there's just no way it's getting out of this hellhole. And another nice line was after simply just bishop f4, trying to go queen b6, forking these pawns. It looks very natural, but unfortunately after just simply castles, queen takes b2, knight b5, it's very difficult to defend against this threat, and if you castle, again this runs into bishop takes h7, black is busted. But unfortunately in these positions, if black just plays something like f6 or h6, the idea f6 for example, just counter strikes in the center, puts pressure on e5, very difficult for white to hold on to this with no d4 pawn to support it. Or, h6, the idea is to just castle and then just sort of play a French position where, white, their pawn at e5 is a bit fragile, there's no Greek's gift sacrifice next move after black castles. So yeah, never been a huge fan of these positions. I've seen database people play h4 and it scores 53%, so I guess this must be good, right? But yeah, in all seriousness, this, can't put it higher than C tier. So I will say, not a bad weapon for Blitz and Rapid. So now moving up into the B tier, we are going to be looking at another variation in the advanced. This one isn't related at all to the one we just looked at, or most variations in the advanced actually, where white plays c3, protecting the d4 pawn. This one's a very strange variation where white plays queen g4. And this looks very irresponsible at first, because after c takes d4, it's what are we going to do? Play queen takes d4 and then knight c6, get our queen chased around the board? But that's not really the idea of the Nimzovich variation, of course named after Oron Nimzovich. That's also what the Nimzo Indian is named after. I should say that's who, rather, not what. But essentially the point in this position that white has is to play knight f3. And what we're saying is we don't really care that much about the d4 pawn actually. What we do care about is the fact we have our queen on the king side. That makes it very difficult for black to develop, say, the bishop on f8. And that we're going to angle all our pieces sort of, maybe not the knight really, but all our pieces are going to be angled towards the king side. The h-pawn could get involved eventually, and only when we really feel like it are we going to sort of maybe bring a knight to d2 and then to b3 and then take on d4. But for now, we're really not too concerned with that at all. But just to give an example variation of how play could develop at this point, let's say black plays knight c6, bishop d3, knight e7, very natural play from both sides so far, knight g6 targeting the e5 pawn, rook e1, and let's say black plays another developing move, bishop b7, knight d2 castles. White plays knight b3, again they're just sort of trying to round up the d4 pawn as I was saying earlier, but there was no real rush to do that. Queen c7, trying to target the e5 pawn. Queen g3, a very typical move to reinforce this guy. And I think a critical move from black at this point would be to play f6, challenging the e5 pawn. At first it looks like this might sort of be okay for black, because after queen takes g6 and knight takes e5 takes, black has this huge pawn mass, which looks rather amusing. But basically white, their attack is going nowhere basically after bishop f6. However, white has this nice resource of playing bishop f4, backing up the e5 square, and if we just exchange a bunch of pieces like this, white's of course very happy. You're going to win back the d4 pawn. Black's dark squares are incredibly weak, and it might look like this is kind of stupid because g5, right? But unfortunately, it doesn't quite work because we have the in-between move e takes f6, attacking the queen, but more importantly, after something like takes, this queen g7 mate, And if you instead take with the queen, well then we can take on e7 and we have a pretty decent advantage in this position. And you know, if black doesn't try to engage in that sort of confrontation with f6, which doesn't tactically work in this precise position, sometimes it does, this time it doesn't though. Bishop d7, let's say, looks like a reasonable move, but after this simply takes, if we evaluate this sort of position, this is a very common outcome in Nimzowitsch variation, where if we really take stock, we have this strong wedge on e5. It's not exactly clear what our next few moves are going to be. We're probably going to play something like c3, reinforce the d4 blockade, develop our bishop somewhere, maybe like g5. Long term, we want to be able to like push his pawn up the board, so something like bishop g5 would help with that. And basically, in the meanwhile, for black, it isn't really so simple for them to do anything, because, like, you know, if they put a rook in the c-file, they want queenside counterplay, then we just play c3, and where's their counterplay, right? And if they try to play in the king side or something like f6, again, this sort of doesn't really work, because after takes, this time it's much more simple, we just take and then go takes on e6. But basically, coming full circles, queen g4 sound, not really, that's why I'm putting it in the B tier. But it does have a lot of practical value. A lot of people don't really know how to play against it. They just kind of assume the only way to play against the advanced, to play with the advanced variation is to play with c3. And so queen g4 definitely has surprise value in that sense, and also not to mention, again, people don't really know the refutation. It usually involves some sort of like quick h5, maybe f6, I already sort of forget, to be honest. So yeah, definitely a solid practical weapon, but if you're like an OTB player and you rack up a bunch of games with this in the database, it might be a bit risky to keep playing this one, let's put it that way. So another line that's going to B tier, this one's very interesting, actually it's where you go bishop d3. It was for a long time considered, at least for me, that the only way you can play this position and deal with the tension on the e-pawn, at least protecting, is to play knight c3 or knight d2. Otherwise, you push it or you take, right? But bishop d3 is a very wacky looking move where it does look like the after takes knight f6, that we're just sort of losing a lot of time with the bishop. Also, I should mention that if knight f6, white just pushes, and in general, this is sort of considered like a very good version of the advance. White can even make use of the fact they haven't developed a knight on g1 yet and play like very aggressively with f4 rather, or play more conservatively with something like e3, and there was this whole line with like knight e2 that I analyzed a couple years ago, but ultimately don't remember too much about. I think like the idea was to go like a3, b4 or something, and maybe use this knight later to go to somewhere like f4. And yeah, actually a surprising amount of people play knight f6, so from that perspective already, bishop d3 is definitely a strong practical weapon, but definitely the best option is to go, also c5 is an option, but okay, let's stick to d takes e4, b4, knight f6. I think this is definitely the most critical variation. This is also the reason why it probably, you know, can't be higher than B tier. It's not necessarily the end of the story though, like, say for example, after c5 knight e2, if black takes this and goes for this whole queen exchange thing, you know, at first it might look like, oh, things are kind of equal, it's an endgame, but actually that couldn't really be further from the truth. Because one, white has this sort of lean development, knight b5 for example could just be a very annoying threat actually, and the other big factor is our bishop on this diagonal is very annoying. It prevents black from developing their pieces easily. So from my perspective, like, if I'm able to get this every game if I play against the French, I would 100% play this bishop d3 variation. However, the problem is, you know, they don't have to take and go into this endgame. They can maybe instead play something like knight c6, and there's all this fury after like knight e5, I think. Again, if they exchange all these pieces and go into the endgame, I'm totally cool with this. This is something I'd happily play. Also, I should reference the database stats. At least in the Lichess database, this is occurred over 5,000 games, and white has around a 63% win rate. Pretty dismal position for black. Definitely pretty dangerous to go into. But again, the issue is that like they have more critical moves like knight e5, harassing the bishop, and again, not necessarily the end of the story yet. Like, there's all these weird lines, I think, where this happens, knight's free, like, taking. You can look more into this. There were some, like, other lines, though, I think, that were even better, like, just, like, not even engaging in confrontation in the center immediately, just going, like, bishop e7, just playing more slowly. I remember these lines being quite difficult to really find any advantage with for white. Again, similar to some of the other lines we've discussed in this video, definitely not a main line, bishop d3. So from that perspective, definitely has a bit of a practical advantage, you could say. So now getting into some real meaty stuff. So after this, we have the advanced variation again, and we're going to be talking about the Barry Milner Gambit after queen b6, bishop d3. And there are sort of two ways to play the Barry Milner Gambit. We're going to be talking about what I'm going to be calling the old Barry Milner Gambit, which is essentially after c takes d4. The new way to play is you just castle here, and you just ignore this d4 pawn. You say like, black, I'm happy if you take here and you help me develop my knight. These odd variations definitely objectively are not quite as good, I would say, where you take on d4. Of course, the issue isn't necessarily that black can win a pawn, because this just loses the queen, of course, to discovered attack. But much rather, the problem is that, like, after this bishop d7 and like castles, knight takes d4, there are two options. One is knight bd2. This is a slightly more modern line, but still describe this as part of the old Barry Milner gambit. Like, for example, one line was like bishop c5, b4 or something. Really sharp lines where white definitely has some very good aggressive chances if you catch a black player out of book. Very unpleasant stuff. And to be honest, this line with b4 and stuff, like especially knight bd2, like I could imagine this maybe being like a notch above B tier, maybe borderline A tier, but definitely like the old stuff where you take on d4 and you go queen takes d4, knight c3. This stuff after a6, like, okay, if black takes it, you can maybe get like a very quick initiative and stuff, but these lines I've never been too convinced by. I think, as a brief synopsis, blacks, you know, they just want to develop their knight c6, they're going to play bishop b7, castles. I'm sure white has some ideas, but personally, and well, objectively as well, like this line I don't think is anything too special. And now for a line which a lot of people write off as just being, you know, like playing for a draw, the exchange variation, where, you know, white, they're generally going to play like knight f3, bishop d3, instead of going for the stuff with c4 that I mentioned earlier. And these lines I would rank as B tier. The bishop d3 stuff immediately, this is more like C tier, I would say. The reason is quite specific, and so when you play bishop d3 immediately, you commit your bishop here too early, because in some lines, we want to put our bishop on b5, or play like a quick c4. For example, in the knight f3 lines, we want to meet an early bishop d6 with c4, and the difference to doing this and, say, this position, is that, notice how in these lines, black would give a check on b4, whereas in these lines, they've already committed the bishop to d6, and if they just try to keep the tension, what we're going to do is not give them the ideal sort of scenario where, like, you know, we're gonna do this and like, oh, they get to take, and like this sort of position would be like very good for black, I think. But the issue is that now what we're going to do is we're going to play this very precise move after knight f6 c5, forcing them to go back to e7, and then like we have this sort of unique position where white is definitely playing for an edge. I think black's not like much worse, but I've always thought that white had their fair share of chances. And essentially that means that if black can't really keep the tension, at least under like optimal circumstances, then they might have to take here, which, and by the way, another cool trap is knight e7 to c5 traps the bishop. Totally irrelevant, well, not really, but okay, d takes c4, this is sort of the main line, but then of course we develop with tempo and get an improved version of the like c4 IQP lines we saw earlier, because we're basically a tempo up, and these positions are quite good. But also another thing about these lines that makes it quite decent is that like, and also like of course like if we just play bishop d3 immediately and then like bishop d6 here, c4 doesn't really work the same because it takes and we lose the tempo, right? That sort of defeats the whole purpose. But after knight f3, what I understand is that if black just plays copycat, what white's going to do is we're not going to castle. If you play like this, the French exchange is really just like C tier. It's just like okay, right? But the big point, however, is that we're going to instead play queen e2 check. And this is a very disruptive check which forces black to make some sort of concession. Either they're going to allow a queen exchange with queen e7, which is not as good as it looks, they're going to play bishop e6, a bit of an awkward move, or they play a backward bishop e7 move, and king f8 is probably something that you don't really want to consider. But personally, I have had some success playing this line with queen e2 check, especially these endgames where it looks like black was just, you know, drawing, it's equal, whatever. If you're the type of person, by the way, who thinks these sort of positions where the queens come off and it's immediately a draw, I want to refer you to my video why playing for a draw never works. I uploaded it like around last week, I think. I'll leave it up in the cards somewhere. And basically, regardless of which way black takes, let's say they take for the king, now a quick castles followed by rook e1, knight e5, it's going to be very uncomfortable to deal with. And also something like bishop takes e7, well now the bishop comes off this diagonal, so we can play a quick bishop f4, let's say c6, we can play like a quick castles, bring the knights to like c3 or d2, double up on the e file, bring the knight to the e5 square. Again, just very unpleasant stuff to deal with. It might, on the surface level, seem like it's not too bad, but trust me, this is definitely a bit more difficult to deal with than it might look at first sight. But yeah, objectively, I think in these positions, best move is bishop e6, but even then, it's not the end of the story. Like knight e5, you can win the bishop here, which is always nice, and definitely is like a low theory weapon. I've always thought the exchange French is a pretty decent option to go with. so long as you play this sort of accurate move order, knight f3, because again, like bishop d3 prematurely, there's a bunch of good setups that the black has, like for example, knight c6 here, going like bishop d6 and knight e7, bishop f5, where they can just like very easily neutralize this bishop here. Another thing I'll note is that in this move order of knight f3, knight c6, white doesn't have to play bishop d3, but can instead play this very precise move bishop d5 and go for this line with bishop d6, c4. And whether we are getting an advantage or not, that's a different discussion, right? But I think definitely we have decent chances for playing for one. But back onto the topic of the advanced variation that we've been talking about a couple times throughout this video already. One line which is nothing special but also definitely deserves some mention or recognition, not sure what the word is after queen b6 going at a3, which is a very solid line. Basically the idea is just go b4, gain space on the queen side, and say after something like knight e7, b4, takes, knight f5, bishop b2. I would say these positions, like white's not necessarily like got an advantage or anything, but it's not easy because, you know, we played b4 in this line for black to necessarily just, you know, pile pressure up on the d4 pawn and take it. But definitely needs some double-edged positions that are very rich and interesting to play, where, you know, if you're the type of person who you like to play with space, definitely not a bad line to look into. But me personally, I've never, probably because I've never really studied it much to be honest, really been a big fan of it. But again, if you like the look of this one, go ahead, take a look at it, see what you think, play some games. Moving on to the next one. So the next one might be a bit of a controversial take of mine. I'm gonna put the wing gambit, which is where you play e5 in this position after c5, where you play b4 in the B tier. And objectively, it might be a bit dubious, right? Like maybe black can even be slightly better out of the opening, which is not a good outcome, generally speaking. However, on a practical level, again, I'm using the word practical a lot in this video, but I think that really has a lot of value. Sometimes it's not necessarily all about the objective evaluation. But yeah, obviously when, you know, a gambit is played, the most principled option is to probably just take it. So we're going to mostly look at this. It's also worth noting though that like a very popular move in the database is knight c6 for some reason, but this is quite bad because after b takes, c5 takes, and like d4. Now, like, white's just going to consolidate the center, and unlike the usual French advanced lines where black plays c5 and challenges the d4 pawn, we've essentially traded the b pawn for the c pawn now, which makes that impossible and definitely gives white just a solid stable edge, where black is really going to struggle big time in this sort of position. A slightly better way though of like declining the gambit is like b6, but that's a bit of a different discussion. What I want to focus on right now is c takes b4, when white's usually going to play a3, and the sort of goal in these positions is to like play something like bishop takes a3, trade off the darks with bishops, bring our pieces to the king side, maybe even push the h pawn a little bit. And yes, we are down a pawn, but the positions are a little bit tricky and not something that the French players are necessarily used to per se, again, because they can't really play c5, challenging the d4 pawn very often, because like again, this guy is steadily protected by a quick c3. So yeah, especially in quicker time controls like rapid and blitz, the wing gambit is definitely very good in my opinion, even in classical. For most players, like around the club level, definitely also very valid. But yeah, that's going to be it for the B tier, moving up to the A tier now. So the first pick for the A tier is going to be maybe slightly odd. It's going to be the King's Indian attack where we play D3. And I was a little bit hesitant to put this in A tier at first. It could be B tier. It's probably somewhere in between there. It's not a hard A tier, whatever that means, right? But yeah, let's go into this. So why am I putting the King's Indian attack in the A tier? Well, basically, it's because very often what we're going to get out of it are these positions where we have our sort of pawn structure, like in the King's Indian defense, very often lined up facing the king's side. And there's a bit of an annoying line, which is sort of the reason why I was hesitant to put this in A tier, but then I was like, Sam, like, no one freaking knows this line. Well, people do, but it's definitely not the most popular line against it. It's to play like bishop d6, instead of putting the knight on f6, to put the knight on e7 instead. I'll just note though, putting the knight on f6 here would be a bit of a mistake, because then eventually these pieces would end up very vulnerable to a e5 fork, which is essentially what white's whole strategy banks on, playing not necessarily the fork per se, but playing e5. Like these positions, it's still a game, it's not like white's worse or anything. They score like okay in the database, but usually what happens is something like knight f6 and you know, like bishop e7, castles, or essentially white's gonna like, you know, do some variation of putting their pieces in some attacking stance like this. Black's gonna play in the queen side, white's gonna play in the king side. We're gonna rush our h pawn up, shove these knights in somewhere, maybe put bishop on f4. White scores very well in the database from these positions, and the reason is quite simple. It's easier to attack than it is to defend. And also one thing that really makes a King's Indian attack strong, at least on a practical level, once again, I swear I'm going to sound like a broken record at this point, is that compared to other lines, these positions really don't resemble at all like anything that you really normally get in a French defense. Like there's no pawn on d4, there's a pawn on e5, right? But it just feels completely different. But also in addition to the King's Indian attack, I'm going to group it in with it, is also this line where you go queen e2. It looks a little bit weird, you know, like why the hell are we bringing our queen to e2? But in the King's Indian attack, very often we're going to do this. And there's some specific move order reasons as to why we do this. For example, like we avoid like d5 immediately because we just take and black can't recapture with the pawn because the pin. And if they have to play queen takes d5, well, now we can laugh at them and say, haha, you're a Scandi player now, and no one really wants to be called a Scandi player, right? So that's why, one reason why queen e2 is a bit tricky. And so this leaves black with two main options. One is to play c5 when we're kind of in an e6 Sicilian where we have our queen weakly placed on e2. But again, it doesn't really matter too much. We're not going to play d4, we're just going to play like knight f3, g3, playing a normal King's Indian attack style setup. And the other main line is bishop e7. The good thing about this move order is that now we played queen e2 and black goes bishop e7. Well, now we've avoided some of like the bishop d6, knight e7 lines I mentioned earlier because they've already committed their piece to the square. And there's another nice point further down the line which I'll show. However, one thing I'll note is that in some of these lines, what black will do is they'll like, I think it's like here, they might like take sometimes and go like quick knight c6, e5. I'm not sure if this exact move order works with like e5 maybe. But yeah, that is one thing that you sort of have to watch out for when you play this whole line. Like black trying to take on e4, and then going e5, and then trying to kind of say we have the symmetrical pawn structure, but your queen looks stupid on e2, stuff like that, right? But to the point I was saying, like the extra option that we have compared to the normal lines is that now say we have these positions. Sorry, actually, I think it was in this position we go g3 immediately. Yeah, this was one, because now, okay, let's say same one, c5, boom, boom, boom. What we're going to do is we're going to play e5, and we're going to make use we haven't yet committed our knight to the d2 square and play c4. And essentially what we're doing is we're immediately challenging the d5 pawn. We're going to develop our knight to a much more active c3 square. And if black just decides to like gain more space with like d4 or something, well now there's not much pressure on our center and we can just freely place our pieces on attacking squares, go for our normal King's Indian attack style thing. And again, just to give stats in the database, 5,000 plus games, 62% win rate for white. Really shaky position for black. But for the other line in the A tier, we are going to be looking at what I'd like to call the modern Barry Milner. I'm sure no one calls it that, but I'm going to call it that. Which is where after, you know, the following moves, bishop d3, c takes d4. We don't take on d4, I mentioned this earlier, but you might have skipped to this point, where white castles instead of taking on d4 immediately. And funnily enough, I remember Chess Dojo made a video on this like way back when, like it might have been 2020 or something. It was lockdown. I remember watching some like video by like Jesse Cry, and I'm like, what the hell is this guy on about? Some weird setup. I didn't really take it too seriously, to be honest. I thought the guy just lost his nuts, but actually it's quite a promising line, and even some very strong players like Magnus Carlsen and a bunch of other elite players have given this line a shot, even in some fairly serious like classical games. And very often, like the idea is that we want to get black to take here, so they help us develop with tempo like this, and if they don't take it, it's going to often turn into some bit of like a weird waiting game where we're not going to take. We're going to play like rook e1 and wait for black to take, and if they play bishop d7, then we're going to go something like h4, preparing to meet any sort of knight g6 stuff with, you know, h5 of course. And this sort of like cat and mouse thing just makes the position very tricky to play, especially if a black player has never seen this before. They're probably just going to concede and play d takes e3, which maybe is okay, but it definitely does play into white's hands. They want to see d takes e3 in the pawn and play knight takes e3 and, you know, gain that tempo. But yeah, coming full circle, the Barry Milner Gambit, especially the modern Barry Milner Gambit, as I call it, where you castle instead of taking on d4 immediately, is definitely a solid A tier. And to be honest, I was even considering putting it in the S tier, but I think it just might not quite be there yet. But, you know, if you're into aggressive, tricky chess and playing positions which your opponent doesn't know well, look no further than the modern Barry Milner Gambit. And so finally, wrapping up with the S tier, we are now going to be talking about the two old school lines, knight c3 and knight d2. I guess first of all, we're going to start with knight c3. This could be called just the main line of the French in general. According to the Lichess database though, the French exchange is actually the main line, so what do I know, right? But knight c3, developing a piece to the center, the most active square the knight can go to, while also protecting, you know, the e4 pawn. And if you play this, there's a couple lines you need to study in particular. Bishop b4, the Weinauer variation, or the Winawer, whatever you want to call it, where you pin the knight and create some absolute havoc. These variations can lead to some very sharp stuff, especially, for example, let's say e5, this is the most principled move. There are some other moves in this position, for example, like taking, this is called the delayed exchange, or not bishop d3, like knight e2, there's also a3, there's queen g4 immediately. Queen g4 is a very typical idea in a bunch of these lines, but playing it immediately just isn't so good. Like, to be honest, all those other lines probably not worthy of S tier, but e5 is the principled move, c5, there's some other stuff where black can play slowly, like b6, or even king f8, I think is in line. Actually, no, I think it's like b6 and say like queen g4, then you go king f8. Bit of a weird move, but very often in these sort of French type positions, black can sort of admit castling, with the point that, well, these positions are often going to be pretty close. They're not going to really open up, so it's not actually a big deal for the king to sit on f8 and never actually castles. Okay, back to the stuff with e5, c5, a3. There's a bit of a weird line. The main line is bishop takes d3 by far, but some people also play bishop a5. It's seen a bit of a resurgence in recent times, especially like the main lines play b4 and then like you take and go knight b5, an idea we see in this video a bit, you know, trying to be a bit tricky. But ultimately the main line is to go takes, and black has a couple options. Queen a5 is one, but the main line is to go knight e7, and this is really what I'd call the main position of the Weinauer, which if you're going to play like knight c3, you probably need to study a fair bit about, unless you're going to play one of these shitty sidelines like knight e2 or a3, queen g4. I won't judge you if you do. Sort of, I will. But okay, the position I really wanted to talk about was this one once again, where white has an array of options. These days, the most popular move, or at least one's very trendy, is to go h4. And as often happens in modern theory, it just so happens that pushing the h pawn also happens to be the best move. There's some lines where black plays like queen c7, I think, and like you get h5 and they like grab a pawn or something like this, but white just has a lot of compensation. So like if you want to line the Weinauer like this position, definitely recommend analyzing h4. A lot to it, the position is definitely very rich, but I think this is probably the best direction for an advantage these days. Whereas these lines after, say, knight e7, queen g4, this was like the old main line, but the problem is like, okay, black can castle and defend the pawn, there's a lot of theory there, but these lines in the poison pawn, they've been like so heavily analyzed. You know, of course, this pawn's under attack, we can't just take, because then queen c3 would be pretty disastrous fork. So, you know, white's going to go like knight e2, there's also this like side line of queen d3, there's all this like theory, you know, you can imagine, right? Like knight e2, black doesn't even take, they go knight c6 instead, white plays f4, they take, and there's all these weird lines like queen d3, d4, takes, you can tell how bored I'm getting, right? They go like bishop d7, they castle long. I mean, pretty exciting positions to be honest, but I've seen a lot of games from when I was younger, like these kids, they'd pretty much all, well, they were my age, so like we were all kids at the time, right? But you know, they all like memorize the same like 20 lines of theory, they'd play this like line out in the board, and they'd always like get a draw within like 30 moves or something. It was pretty boring to watch, to be honest. But yeah, this line, I like with queen g4, it's technically principled in the sense, but I just don't really recommend going into it these days, because it's just so heavily analyzed out, especially with chessable and stuff. It's so easy to like memorize all these long lines as well. So going h4 I think is definitely the better direction. But that being said, there's also stuff like knight f6. This is another huge variation. The classical, where after e5 there's knight f d7, and what you don't want to do is play knight f3. This would be a bit of a mistake, which I committed when I was younger. Actually, I didn't really know what the heck I was doing. This was still like late 2015. This is when I had no clue of opening theory. My national rating was 800, but then I increased 700 points, went to 1500. It was a crazy time, but one thing I knew at that time was tactics. One thing I did not know, however, was openings. So yeah, I didn't know what I was doing. Again, I didn't even know d takes c5 to play this. I played some rubbish like bishop b5. I gave up the bishop pair. It was an absolute shit show. But yeah, what you have to do in this position is to play f4, and then after c5, you get all these positions in the Steinitz where you have a space advantage. but black is also somewhat solid. The other alternative is to go like bishop g5 in this position. Arguably though, this Dynast is simpler because you just push the pawn and then you only really have to study like this position, whereas if you play bishop g5, you have to study this, you have to study this, you have to study this, a lot of stuff that you actually have to really get a grips on. And then the other variation which you sort of have to learn, which is probably a lot easier than the other two because the positions are just not that strategically complicated, is a Rubinstein variation, where black tries to just, develop soundly, castle, Finko, their other bishop, play c5 eventually. You do sort of need to know what you're doing though against the Rubinstein if you want to get an advantage. The line I remember and like most is you just take and then go g3. And you just try and Finko your bishop on this long diagonal, and if black doesn't really do anything, direct, you just sort of get like a nice advantage. Like, I think black's best move in this position was to play b6, trying to meet like bishop g2 with bishop b7. There's some nuances where you like play bishop b5 check and then go bishop d7, provoke this guy to a square where it's not on this diagonal, right? And then you go like a4 here to back the bishop up, some, high-tech stuff, right? And say if like g3 in this position, you go c5, well then, similar to some positions we saw earlier in like the bishop d3 lines where we saw these endgames, right? Where I was saying like, black, they don't want to really go into this because we're just better, like active pieces, bishop on this diagonal, my arrows are all over the place, forgive me for that. Well, it's sort of similar in this position again after like bishop g2, c takes d4, where we're going to take on d4, takes, and now we have this bishop on the long diagonal, a knight on d4. It's almost exactly the same, except instead of the bishop being on f3, it's on g2 and we play g3, right? A very unpleasant endgame to play. 10 out of 10 times I would take this. But that's a bit of a side note, right? It's like d takes e4 is definitely not the most popular approach to play in the French. But yeah, just giving my input on that variation as to what I think is a pretty good line. And finally, the other line is going into the S tier. Slightly less principled, you could say, than the knight c3 line, but also definitely very strong is knight d2. This was a favorite of Anatoly Karpov back in his heyday when he was more of a 1e4 guy, but then later switched to d4. Back when he played e4 though, he was a big fan of the Tarrasch, and very often you get these positions where knight f6 line, where you get these lines, right, where, stuff happens, black plays f6, and like, these lines happen a lot where either that or like castles, and there's some sharp stuff that you need to know after like takes, knight e4, where like black can sack and exchange on f3, and it's technically not supposed to be that good objectively, but if you have never really studied it, it can be quite dangerous. Or the other lines where in this position, black does not play castles, they play queen c7, stopping bishop f4, right? These you definitely need to study. There's like bishop g5, there's g3, there's like knight e3, bishop d2 is a line I remember studying back in the day. But yeah, in general, these positions as a Tarrasch player, you need to be very comfortable in these to play this variation, because generally considered this is one of the better variations of the Tarrasch, this whole knight f6 thing. There is also like a line where you can, instead of putting the knight in e2, you can actually, like if we go back to this position, right, you can put the knight in f3 instead. But when you play this way, you're sort of implying a bit of a gambit where after castles, takes, sort of similar to the Barry Milner actually, but arguably maybe even slightly improved version. This is pretty sound where you like go for this whole thing. Definitely worth checking out. However, again, the most important line to Tarrasch is also I should note there's like a lot of weird stuff like I mean, okay, first of all, the Rubinstein, we've dealt with that, but there's some weird stuff like bishop e7, h6, a6, stuff that doesn't really make sense against knight c3, but is not so bad against knight d2. And the reason is that, like, okay, I'll say bishop e7, the idea is essentially the same, actually, remarkably, in all these variations, which is that now after knight f6, e5, bishop d3, these shenanigans, right? That after, say, knight c6 and castles, black is going to make use of the fact that they have not yet castled and they're just going to play g5 themselves. And the whole point of these variations is to just play g4 basically next and destabilize the knight here and ultimately the white center. Like if we just play some random move, g4, well actually I think in this position the knight's is trapped, so that's a terrible example. So let's say instead maybe like a3 for example, well then g4, knight e1, and black can't really win a pawn immediately because this queen takes g4. Maybe that's still good for them, but probably best is just to go like h5 or something. And this pawn long term is weak. Black has definitely attacking chances, which is why usually in these positions white will just play d takes c5 and then meet like g4 with knight d4, I believe. And yeah, you have to be ready to enter some like sort of sharp, weird looking positions like these. I think white's ultimately better, but just something to keep in mind as you play the Tarch, that these sort of weird variations, they do exist. But okay, the main line of the Tarch, and maybe not main line according to Lichess database, but the one I think is the most critical is to go c5, when after e takes d5, there's also like knight gf3, I think like Wesley So recommended this or something, but yeah, e takes d5, black sort of has two main options. One is to go e takes d5, and eventually, like after some exchange of pawns like this, they're going to end up with an IQP. So I've always enjoyed playing those sort of positions with white. It's not necessarily like white's is clearly better or anything, because black's in the IQP, and a lot of players sort of have that sort of belief regarding them. They're not that bad, I think. But I would ultimately say that queen takes d5 is just a tiny bit more solid than e takes d5. And this is definitely the most critical line of the Tarch, which you probably need to study to some extent if you're gonna play this whole variation. For example, like after knight f3 takes, there's a choice between queen d7, queen d6. Queen d7 is sort of like what the cool kids do these days. Queen d6 is like the old school variation, when after castles, knight f6, white wins back the pawn, and some stuff happens. The position looks a bit dry, but that's very often what happens in the Tarch. You sort of just aim for more of a slight positional edge rather than trying to go for any sort of like crazy attacking play or anything of that nature. But one thing I like about the Tarch is that it very often doesn't play into the hands of the French player, in the sense that because their objectively best line is to maybe go for something like this, the positions are a lot more open, and it's not really in the style of the French, which many players like, which are very often these more closed positions, right, with knight f6. But objectively, the knight f6 wins, even though it's been along the main line of the Tarch for black for a long time. Definitely more recently, it's been found that these sort of positions are a bit sketchy for black, with, you know, the positional weaknesses, like on e5, the backward e6 pawn. It's not like, you know, it's refuted or anything, but definitely like at the top level, going for this sort of line of black is much rarer than going for something like c5, which definitely reflects that sort of view that this is sort of the way that black should play. But at the end of the day, for most people, does this really like high level, this is, you know, what you need to play at the top level, matter for plebs like us? Maybe not, probably not, right? But with that being said, I hope you guys have found this video useful and that you've come away with a line that you might be playing against French from now on, or if nothing else, you were just entertained for the last hour or however long this video was. But yeah, if you enjoyed it, please like the video, subscribe, the usual. Free newsletter down in the description below for sort of weekly-ish or bi-weekly-ish articles on chess improvement. But nonetheless, hope you guys have a good day, and I will see you until next time.